News Radio 700 WLW.
Scott Phone Show on 700 WLW. Where are we on COVID testing? You know, you hear about vaccines and mandates for masks, and we're debating this in schools and whether kids should get the vaccine and forced vaccinations. But what about the testing end of this whole thing? It kind of blew up. I don't know if you heard about this. I didn't see it, obviously, or look at the clip, but it was literally a dumpster fire on The View Friday morning because of COVID testing. Dr. Colleen Payne Nabors is the CEO of MCI Diagnostics, and that's what they do. They do testing and rapid testing and stuff. And Doctor, good morning. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I am well, Scott, and thank you for having me this morning.
Absolutely. For those who didn't follow or hear about, so on The View, I guess on Friday morning, two of the hosts were pulled like literally in the middle of the show because they had tested positive for coronavirus. Afterwards, it turned out after two follow-up tests, just to make sure, it turns out they were actually negative, but they pulled them off the air in the middle of the show. And I can't fathom why it would be that urgent. It seems like there's a lot of problems still with the testing thing. We talk about vaccines, we talk about masks. No one talks about prevention. No one talks about the rapid testing. We seem to be far behind on this compared to a lot of places in the world, right?
Well, it's not that we're far behind. It's just that with the pandemic, we're having to utilize a lot of different tests. And I think the general public just doesn't understand the testing. And with what happened on The View, we test for Disney, we test for Lionsgate, we test for a lot of SAG productions. And that should not have happened in that format. I think that looking at how we test, I think that there were some handling issues because to have two positive people that were vaccinated in the same time frame become positive I think Anna in her Instagram post on Friday or Saturday indicated that she had an antigen test. So if I can just for a moment just break down the test, because I think that the confusing part is President Biden has sent out millions and millions of antigen tests. Antigen tests were originally designed for quick access to immediately identify positive people in a pool.
Okay.
It is not the best test because it is a quick test. And what that means is that if you're in a correctional facility, potentially a school or a nursing facility, or where there's a mass number of people, it will quickly identify positive people only at a rate of 84%. Mm-hmm. So the problem is with this particular test, an antigen test, doesn't identify millions and millions of DNA cells. It localizes to a number of cells, DNA.
Yes.
So an antigen test is not the end-all, be-all. And if you look at just about any and all manufacturers' suggestion is that it immediately positive or negative. It should be confirmed with a RT-PCR COVID test, which is the gold standard of testing. And so when the ladies were found positive on The View, I think that there were a number of issues. I think it had something to do with, I hate to always say this, but I think it had something to do with operator issues, how they handled the samples.
Sure, it makes sense. It makes sense because you have two hosts and you know, they're both vaccinated and they both test positive. It's probably from the same I know this. I want to say the same batch, but you know what I'm saying is there's probably a bunch of them that were handled improperly. So, you know, on that too, though, it seems like are we doing enough antigen testing? I mean, I get it. You know, like in Europe, for example, that's how they do it, and they say, okay, this person tests positive, let's flag them, but we got to make sure we do a deeper dive to make sure they test positive before we start closing everything down. It seems like this is reactionary on our part, but in other parts of the world, as I mentioned, like in the UK, for example, students there, kids aren't wearing masks. They're not doing all the stuff that we're doing here, but they've also deployed a lot more rapid testing so that they can find those individuals and go, hey, let's test you again to be sure. And then if they test positive, yeah, okay, it's COVID. If not, then you're allowed to return. This was just very high profile on television, and that's the difference. It seems like right now we should be further along when it comes to not only rapid testing, but the gold standard testing too. Are we not?
We're not. Because when you look at it, just the fact that we're having so many schools open and closed, the tests that they have are antigen tests. It's a $5 test. And so what ends up happening is in most of these scenarios that it's really a good test for positives, that it will more than likely 84% of the time, most of them are between the 80 percentile, will catch whether or not you're positive. But a lot of young people, their immune systems are much stronger, so therefore they are asymptomatic. And the asymptomatic people that the antigen does not catch are the ones that we're still fighting with. That's why we're still having so many issues with COVID. So MCI Diagnostic, we're in all 50 states. We typically do not do an antigen $5 or $10 test because regardless to when you do that test, positive or negative, manufacturer says you must follow up with a PCR test. And so that piece is historically left out. So if you look at what happened on The View, I do believe that was some operator error. I don't think that they handled that situation correctly. I don't think that the testing was done correctly. And then they had 3-4 different follow-up to PCR, which is a gold standard. Even though we're vaccinated, I want to be very clear to say, with the Delta virus and the Lambda virus and the Mu, we're still having a lot of breakthrough cases, So it is not unusual that we still can test the workforce or test the school systems, and we're looking for those positive cases because it still is occurring. You look at a great percentage of the people that are vaccinated. So I don't want to disturb from that, but the antigen test, I think we have to be very conscientious with testing and understanding that those results look for the very positive. But if you're asymptomatic or if you are not, or that sample is not handled correctly, this is what happens.
Okay.
And we had a lot of that.
Dr. Colleen Payne, Nabors, she's the CEO of MCI Diagnostics, and it's a national company, and they do the testing that we're talking about here that we often don't talk about, and it seems like we should have a lot more of these things. So take me through that. What happened on The View is a blip, I think, on the news radar, but I think it's a high-profile error, right? When in the middle of a live show, they take 2 people off because they tested positive in an antigen test, which has low reliability. It turns out later they are fine. It was just a false positive times 2. That then further causes the public to distrust medicine, distrust the system, distrust the tests, and more. It doesn't help.
It doesn't help, but it also gives the public. This was such a high-profile case that it gives the public now knowledge. What is an antigen test? Am I getting an antigen test versus a PCR? Is my family safe? Because you look at all the heroics that happened on that show. Vice President Biden's whole staff had to be notified. Sonny's husband's a surgeon. He had to be pulled out of surgery. So it's a continuous loop when that happened. But at the same time, now the general public says we are more educated, we're more informed. When you go and have a test or when you're trying to fly, we have a testing center at Dallas Love Field. And one of the biggest things that we are constantly fighting is that people will come and say, I need to fly, but I have an antigen test. We will not let you fly with an antigen test. So it just brought up another level of the testing that's available. It's PCR, which is the gold standard, RT-PCR, which is DNA. Then we have the antigen test that it's a 15-minute rapid test. But then there's a really great test that we will do, which is a PCR rapid test that we utilize with Abbott. That test, we've done research on it, and it stands with the gold still because it is a PCR. And then we have the antibody testing. So there's three different tests: PCR, antigen, and antibody test, which I think that overall the general public typically gets those all mixed in together, and they think that they're having one and the same test, and they all have very different functions.
Well, on that, take me through that, Doctor. So most of us don't have an experience getting one of these tests, and there's a lot of confusion between antigen, antibody, PCR. Let's just start with this one. The simplest, the cheapest one, as you said, $5-10. is the antigen test, right? How is it administered? Take me through the chain of custody, if you will, all the way to the lab. What happened, and what happens if I test positive, and take me through that whole narrative.
So an antigen test is what we can now find at Walgreens, CVS. Some of the little facilities will do these quick tests. So an antigen test is still a nasal collection. It's still a nasal collection, 5 seconds per nostril, and it is put into a tube of a solution. And what we do is we extract the DNA. Then we do a quick rapid test with, most of the time we can either, with the Binex, it's a visual. We just pour the solution with the DNA mixed onto a card, and we're able to look at and get the results within 15 to 30 minutes. And then the other part is what we do is we look at that and we get the results, and it's just a quick. Takes about 15 to 30 minutes. The quicker you get a response means the more positive that individual is. So that's an antigen test. It's still a nasal collection, but the difference is it's just rapid, and it's only identifying. It's not amplification, which means that we're not amplifying, looking for millions of DNA samples. It's just an isolated sample. That is an antigen test, which means that the sensitivity and specificity of that is usually about between 84 and 90%, depending on the manufacturer. And it will tell you in the paperwork, in manufacturer's paperwork, that even if you're positive or negative, you must be confirmed for true results with the RT-PCR, which is the gold standard. So an antigen test is just a quick test. Then we have I'll go to the antibody test. The antibody test is a test that it's a serology test in which we draw blood, and we can do a finger stick. We have cheaper methodologies of antigen serology tests. And the antibody test looks and determines whether or not you have the antibodies for COVID-19. And what that means is that we take a sample of your blood. At MCI Diagnostic Center, we actually run your blood because we don't do a lot of the home tests. We don't do any of those. There are a couple ones that we could verify that are antibody tests that are pretty good. And we run a sample of your blood, and we look to see if you have IgG and IgM, which means that we're looking for the beginning stages of your body actually creating its own antibodies or defense mechanism for the virus. So that's the antibody test. And then, of course, we have the gold standard of all testing, which we pretty much hear that you want to have a RT-PCR, which is nucleic acid amplification testing. And what we do there is we collect a nasal sample, and then we take it to the laboratory, and we actually process that sample. And that sample, we do amplification. So when we do an amplification, we are getting millions of DNA cells. And when we take those cells, there are very few mistakes that are made on DNA. I mean, there can be, so when we do that test, it typically will sometimes it can take 16 hours. When we first started doing COVID collections, we were at almost running these tests for 24 hours. We got down to 11. We got down to 4. MCI now runs at about 78 minutes. And now what we can do is we can look at that sample and almost 100% accuracy tell you whether or not you are positive or not. And so what happened on The View was it created whole a pandemonium in their families. You know, Sonny had to call her husband. He had to be pulled out of surgery. She just lost 2 in-laws. Her son had to be called. The daughter, anyone that she touched, anyone that she had been around. So it was just a domino effect. But there's 3 tests, and I'll repeat them without the explanation. There's the gold standard, RT-PCR. There's antigen, which is a quick 15-minute test. And there is the antibody test. So each one of these tests have its own place in time for a patient or for someone. I personally want to know, I test my staff routinely. I want to know how much in terms of antibodies do we have. So we are tested, even with the vaccine.
Right.
My staff is still tested biweekly because I now know, and being on the ground in so many different states, we've been on the ground in about 17 states. We've tested, we provide the vaccine at MCI, but I also want to know what our antibodies are. And so when everyone else was getting, we were looking at the vaccine, we could look at our antibodies. Do we have enough to stay safe in this pandemic? So those are the things that we always have to remember. An antigen test, even though you might do an antigen test, you have to be very conscientious and look at the signs and symptoms. And if it's a clinical setting, we want to make sure that, if someone's been positive, because a lot of young people really are asymptomatic walking around. When COVID first started, I would spend all of my evenings calling young people and saying, okay, how are you feeling?
Yeah. They'd
say, I'm great. And do you have any signs? Have you lost taste? You aching? And it would always be no. It would just about 90% of the time, I would call the younger generation, and they were just walking through. Unfortunately, the Delta virus does not allow as many people to walk through,
right,
because that virus has now spread and multiplied into different, and
it got better at doing what viruses do, right? The mutations have caused it to be more efficient, maybe not as deadly, but more efficient. And, real quick, I only got a couple seconds, but you mentioned, okay, well, with the antigen test, we're at about 80-something% false positivity rate. If you get a false positive, can you also get a false negative?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why manufacturers suggest that regardless if you're positive or negative, it should be confirmed with an RT-PCR. That's not my suggestion. Most of the manufacturers will say with an antigen test, you still should be followed up. And the CDC guidelines is if you get a negative or positive antigen test, you should be followed up with the actual CDC guideline RT-PCR.
Yeah, we need more tests. We need to ramp that up. I'll save that for maybe another time here, but now you know how the testing thing works anyway, and it's fascinating too, which I think certainly we can agree more of that would be better. Dr. Colleen Payne Nabors, she's the CEO of MCI Diagnostics. Thanks again for joining the show. Appreciate it. We'll talk again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.